This today sees the 80th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union by Hitler and Nazi Germany in the Second World War.
June 1941. In the streets of Moscow and Leningrad, in the presence of Marshal Stalin, Foreign Minister Molotov puts pen to an Anglo-Soviet agreement committing both sides to fight together until final victory. Then it is for Sir Stafford Cripps to sign in the same room, perhaps even on the same table, as had Herr von Ribbentrop a bare 2 years before.
Until I knew we were going to be talking about it, I'd never really seen this before. But just looking at that footage, there's Stalin just standing there in this room, and you think, well, that just must be somebody that looks like Stalin. Because we have such interesting and curious observations of how these people would have looked kind of in situ. But when you actually see it, there's something just almost overwhelming, to use that phrase. The importance, of course, of Barbarossa has long been overlooked. It was not only a fatal gamble, it was how Hitler actually lost the war. Jonathan Dimbelby puts this in its proper place in history for the first time, the most important struggle in the annals of the 20th century. He joins us now. Jonathan Dimbelby, good afternoon.
Ian, good afternoon to you.
Nice to have you with us. I was thinking a little earlier about when it comes to writing a book based on anything around the war. There's about 10 billion of these things being written. How do you stumble across the one area, the story that still needs to be told?
You're right about everything that's been written, and you look and think, has all of this been written?
Yeah.
The thing about history generally is it's like there's unbelievable quantities of information, every people's lives going back for near infinity, and it's you put together a jigsaw puzzle of it if you're an historian. In this case, Barbarossa has been written about, some brilliant military histories. And I just wanted to take a fresh look at it. And I've read a lot of other people's writings on the Second World War generally, of course, and also on the Eastern Front, which is where this took place. And I thought I can do something by explaining again and freshly, if you like, the horror of this conflict, the greatest invasion ever mounted in history, more than 3 million Axis troops, artillery, tanks, panzers, the rest of it, plus 600,000 to 700,000 horses to fulfill the artillery. But on the other side, an even bigger army, but most of it was only semi-mobilized. At the front, there was only a very small proportion because Stalin believed it wasn't going to take place. So you have this extraordinary invasion on 3 fronts. And for a while, it looks as though it's going to be game over and that Hitler will have prevailed with extraordinary potential consequences. But my view is that he wasn't going to prevail, and that part of the book is about that, as well as the horrors of the war, the beginnings of the Holocaust, the extermination of Jews, and just the murderous scale of barbarism on the battlefield, which is unrivaled in the Second World War anywhere else, including what happened on the Japanese front. Yeah,
indeed. And just talk us, Jonathan, through the motive, Hitler's thinking at this point of thinking, right, next invasion, USSR. What led to that? Because one might think, as an observer now, there would have been almost a synergy between these two leaders and countries. But clearly Hitler had other ideas here.
They had done a deal just before the war that they wouldn't fight each other. So that and there had been a lot of negotiation between London and Moscow, and separately Moscow to Berlin. And when it became clear to Stalin that there was no possibility of a deal with London, he did the deal with Hitler. And Hitler, though, was always determined, right back in the Mein Kampf days, that he needed, quotes, Lebensraum, to meet the needs of the German people that had been taken away from them after the First World War. Lebensraum, space in Eastern Europe. He loathed and abhorred and wanted to destroy Bolshevism, and he linked together, umbilically linked together, Bolshevism and Judaism. And he wanted to eradicate the Jews from the soil of Europe. He didn't much care how it was done. It happened that with Himmler and Heydrich, it began in earnest behind the lines as the German armies advanced, the beginnings of the extermination in the most hideous circumstances. By the end of 1941, 6 months into the invasion, more than 1 million Jews, including children, being bayoneted and thrown up in the air and then tipped into pits. More than 1 million Jews of the 6 million who would eventually perish. It was the death toll on the battlefield was enormous, but it was Hitler thought that he could still prevail, and he went on. My view is he'd actually lost it by the time he was stopped at Moscow in December 1941, having lost casualties around 1 million. Stalin's casualties were much greater, over 4 million, but nonetheless, Germany was getting weaker rather than stronger. But his goal was destroy the Soviet Union, take land and plant that land with good Aryan people who could farm on it and become fighter peasants. It is lunatic, of course, but that's
absolutely
what it was.
Of course it was. What I find, and for some reason this is never lost on me, everything we're talking about now, I mean, we have it in our minds and we think of history, something that happened hundreds of years ago, etc. I mean, there are people alive today, of course, who were familiar with. We played the Pathy News clip just before you came on of that famous signing, and seeing Starling in the room, as I said at the beginning. It's incredible to see this actual moving person, not some sort of still image of this man. And of course, this is such recent history. We must never forget that the people alive, right, possibly listening to this right now, would have remembered that news clip that I played and seen it at the time. We have in my mobile phone, I've got the number of Holocaust survivors in my phone because many of those people are still alive. This is still incredibly recent in the grander scale.
Ian, that is so important and so true. And in the Soviet Union as was, and in Russia as is, and in Eastern Europe, these are still very vivid memories. Yeah. Even amongst the young, because the horror of the battlefield lives with them still to a huge degree. And everyone who was on this side of the battle, fighting from west to east, of course, grandchildren want to know about their grandfathers and their grandmothers. And I don't think that goes away. But there's another thing. I do believe it's important, which is part of my motive for writing the book, although I don't sort of hammer the point at all. The dangers of breaking up of a continent. The history of Europe is battle. It's war. And in the case of these two, the two great powers of Europe, Russia, the Soviet Union as was, and the German Empire that then became Germany, they were always going to be in friction. Everything that you see today in Eastern Europe has its origins in the conflicts that predated the First World War, continued after the First World War, and were never actually finally resolved as a consequence of the Second World War and the Cold War. So the bubbling in Europe all the time has to be, I think, understood only by understanding how we got to this point and being alert to the fact that, not in the same way, of course, but alert to the fact that what happened before in a different way can happen again in different sorts of ways with different kinds of effect. But fragility of peace and order and democracy should never be far from our minds. Indeed.
And just remind us, Jonathan, and again, the clip we played alluded to this, the British involved, the British, signing this deal with the USSR, which again would have unthinkable that this would have happened.
Yeah, if you think, two things. One, the fiercest opponent of the Soviet Union, who spoke in the most powerful terms, originally in the 1920s, was Winston Churchill. In the 1930s, he was alone virtually in saying we have to have an agreement with the Soviet Union because the real threat is Hitler. Of course, Chamberlain then took the Hitler option until it fell apart after Poland. Then an incredible speech, which still exists on radio, immediately after the invasion. This evening, 80 years ago, Churchill took to the airwaves in one of these great speeches and said, well, he deplored communism. He thought about the jackboots marching over the soil of peasants' homes. And it was a very eloquent speech. And at that point, and very soon afterwards, that deal that you identified was signed between the British and the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, just
extraordinary stuff.
Just incredible to see that. I mean, in terms of how things were covered back then as well. I mean, it's a slightly separate point, but you've been a journalist for many years, and it's in your family, your blood, etc. Just following those events, do you think we were, despite not having 24-hour news channels, social media, and the like, how to tell those stories to relatively small amounts of people when you consider audiences back in the 1940s and the like? It would have largely been on the wireless, as it would have been known. But
yeah, but Ian, you're on the wireless, as it were.
True.
We are
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
The wireless just happened to reach very widely across the United Kingdom and across the world. Huge numbers used to listen. Of course, on all sides, there was military censorship. There was no, everyone was embedded with their military forces. My father was BBC's first war correspondent, fighting all the way through to Berlin. And in Russia, it was particularly difficult because we're talking about a dictatorship, a ferocious dictatorship, incidentally, that controlled access to the media. So it was quite difficult to report anything that was really happening except through the medium of the censors and the information services in Moscow until later in the war. But nonetheless, we got something of a picture until 1944 and after D-Day, when, of course, it became much easier because the Brits and the Americans were on the front foot then advancing. And then there was a lot of very high quality reporting from on the spot.
Absolutely. Am I right in saying your father did the commentary for Churchill's funeral? Is that right?
It was his last great commentary in 1965, at the beginning of 1965. He half broke down during it, which was very unusual. And it was a very memorable event with all the figures. You were talking earlier about the figures that you see. Stalin, of course, Stalin wasn't there. Yeah. He was long dead, but other great figures and saying, well, we're all there for the funeral. De Gaulle, you name him, and Eisenhower. And he was already very ill as it happened, and he died at the end of 1965. Wow. And at the beginning of 1966, he was memorialized in Westminster Abbey. That's a personal thing of which I'm very proud.
I didn't realize that.
It was televised on BBC and on ITV.
Yeah, that piece of commentary. I mean, I know we're in slightly different territory here talking about this, but I think that should be played in journalism schools at universities in terms of the things that the boxes, as you know and I know doing this job, the amount of boxes you try to tick when you're doing something like that, the sensitivity, the backdrop, the information, all that's going on at the same time. It is such a supreme piece of dignified, beautiful, intelligent and eloquent commentary on a global event such as Churchill's funeral. I think kids who go to journalism schools should be made to watch that and say, this is how you do it.
Well, it's interesting because more than one of our very distinguished colleagues have noted what you've noted about that broadcast, the ability to annotate the scene, not to tell you everything.
Correct, yeah.
The pictures tell you a great deal, but to explain the meaning of what is happening. And his other great broadcast, actually going back to the Second World War, was the liberation of Belsen concentration camp, which is still in the Jewish archives. More than 1 million Jews, incidentally, were killed in that first 6 months, which I write about in the book. But the senior broadcasters will say that was we could all learn from that. I think we can quite often learn from the greats from the past.
Yeah, you must be very proud of that. Although you've not done so bad yourself, Jonathan. Of course, it should be added. This book, I'm looking at this. It's an absolute shelf breaker of a book. This clearly took you more than a couple of weeks to put together.
It took a bit more than a couple of weeks. I'm glad you called it a shelf breaker, not any other kind of breaker. Anyway, I hope it's also illuminating, and I hope people. I mean, I've had a lot of comments about it that it's gripping. I mean, I don't want to shock people for the sake of shocking them. Sure. I shock because it's important to understand. But I have tried to write something that people generally will want to read if they're not already very familiar with the territory.
Indeed, and congratulations as well. It's fabulous. Thank you, Jonathan Dimbelby, for joining us this afternoon here on Talk Radio. The book is called Barbarossa: How Hitler Lost the War.